Breath of the Wild is without a doubt the most difficult 3D Zelda, and probably the most difficult Zelda period since the first two games on NES. And when I say difficult, I don't necessarily mean it's hard to figure out or has hard puzzles, I mean it kills you a lot. Difficult in the sense that stuff makes you die more than in other Zeldas, in combat and out. I mean, 3D Zelda games in particular haven't traditionally provided much challenge in the past. Majora's Mask required a lot of careful planning and time management, and Skyward Sword could be hard as heck when the motion controls weren't working properly, but really, combat has for the most part been really easy, with hearts aplenty. The addition of Hero Mode has certainly helped in this regard, but in most games, unless you're facing a ton of foes all at once, it's a simple matter of protecting yourself and striking when you get the chance, or using an item to open the baddie up. Taking damage comes less from a difficult fight and more from a lack of patience and a desire to just swing your sword like crazy. Breath of the Wild takes the series in a whole new direction. Firstly, it's interesting to note that it's the only Zelda game where it starts hard and only gets easier the longer you play. Like when you boot it up and you don't have anything and you don't know what you're doing, it is hard as heck. But the more you play and the stronger you get, the easier it is to navigate until you reach a point where you can blast through every baddie you come across. There's a slight element of easier as you go in other Zelda games only because when you start a file, you've usually only got 3 hearts, meaning you can only take a few hits even from little guys. Once you get a few extras, it becomes easier in a sense, though of course the challenges and the baddies do ramp up as you go, as is traditional. In Breath of the Wild though, if you take your time like I did, it really does just get easier the whole way through, even with baddies ramping up. I'm getting a little ahead of myself though, I'll talk more about progression in a bit. Right now I want to focus on that more difficult early stage of the experience. I'm talking about the Great Plateau, where the game starts. When you wake up, you're given some clothes that offer very little protection and you're spat out into the world. And considering some Zelda games are infamous for having hours-long opening sections where you've got to do loads and loads of busy work before you can even get a sword, Twilight Princess, anyone? The Great Plateau slaps you right in the face with the realization that this ain't the Zelda you're used to, son. There's no hand-holding here. We ain't giving you nothing. If you want to do something, you gotta figure out how to do it, and you've got to be good enough to do it. No Master Sword, and not even so much as a wooden practice sword. Nope, you just start out picking up sticks and hitting monsters with them. If you want better weapons, then you have to win them or steal them from those monsters, or if you're lucky, find them hidden in chests. Then of course you find that all weapons break after a while. Here at the beginning of the game, sometimes after only a few hits. So this keeps you moving, fighting to earn enough weapons to protect yourself with. Again, weapon breakage is something I'll talk more about in a bit. There's so much to all this that it's really hard not to get ahead of myself. But anyway, one really big thing that makes the game harder at this early stage is the complete and utter lack of recovery hearts. You don't get them from downed enemies, you don't get them from grass or pots, you can't find them anywhere. They don't exist in this game. This is the case in the hero modes from previous games, but this time it's like that right in the base experience. If you want to heal, you've got to gather food and eat it. Nothing respawns either, at least not this early. For me, Blood Moons came much later. When you pick up an apple and eat it, it's gone. And it's not like there isn't enough food on the Great Plateau, but it's certainly not something you can farm infinitely or find instantly no matter where you are. This gives you a real, actual need to be careful, and when you make a mistake and get hurt, you've got to work to make yourself well again. And that happens a lot because, like I said, this game likes to kill you. There was a really big moment for me within maybe the first half hour of the game. I was wandering around and came to a cliff. I wanted to know what was at the bottom of the cliff, so I did what I would do in any Zelda game. I jumped off, and I died. And I was like, oh, that's what kind of game this is. All at once, I understood. I realized that it wasn't gonna baby me like the other Zeldas. I wasn't some indestructible superhero. I actually had to try, like a real person would. And that was just incredible to me. It was such a huge revelation. It was invigorating. It's pretty funny splatting off a high cliff and having such a big whoa moment. It should be obvious that when you jump off a cliff, you go splat, but this was such a new thing for Zelda, and it said something. I knew from that moment on that this game would require a lot more of me, and I would go on to discover that, yeah, I was right to think that. Another big moment was when I figured out how to cook, which you might have heard me talk about in my first impressions video way back when. The game does tell you how to perform all your basic actions, but some of the deeper stuff is harder to figure out. The mysterious old man can be found in a few different places, and he gives you some pointers, but probably like many people, it was a good while before I found his cabin, which is where the game gives you a little rundown on cooking. Here's how it went with me. I wanted to go up the snowy mountain to reach one of the shrines, but I couldn't because it was so cold that I constantly took damage. This was another really big revelation of how harsh the world could be. So I fell back a ways to this very conveniently placed enemy camp. After clearing out the enemies, I found these peppers that claimed to help fend off the cold. Thing was, just eating them raw didn't seem to work, and there didn't seem to be an option in the menu to combine them into dishes. There was a cooking pot in the camp, so I figured, okay, maybe I need to cook them in this pot. But again, there was no command for it popping up, so I thought, well, maybe it needs fire. It felt like a long shot that any of this would work, but I jabbed the nearby campfire with a spear, and sure enough, it caught, and then I jabbed the pot, and sure enough, it lit that fire. I still couldn't get it to work though, and I kept thinking I must have needed the ghost guy to tell me how to cook before I could do it, or give me a special spoon or something that let me do it. But then I was playing around in the menus again when I saw that I could hold items. I didn't know exactly what that would accomplish, but I soon found that I could hold multiple items at once. Then, there was my command! I had to hold the ingredients and chuck them into the pot myself. So I mixed my peppers with some other stuff and made a potion that let me push into the cold area, and that whole experience was immeasurably rewarding. Especially after playing a game where on one of the last dungeons in the whole thing, your companion has to stop everything to remind you that you can shoot arrows to hit switches. This was just incredible. The game didn't hold my hand. It didn't explicitly tell me what to do and why I should do it. It didn't halt my progress until I jumped through the right hoop. Despite the fact that I missed the place where it would have taught me in a more direct manner, it gently and naturally led me to learn all this myself. It presented me with a need, then gave me the tools to figure out how to meet that need. And golly gee, you know what they call that? Good game design. And really, the whole plateau is like this. It's intricately crafted to teach you nearly everything you need to know about the game. It technically is a starting area that you can't escape unless you complete certain tasks, but it never feels that way. It's only a tiny chunk of the map, but it still feels massive, especially the first time. It's so big that I didn't mind exploring it one bit. I spent hours and hours on it before moving on. That's a tutorial right there. That's a tutorial done right. It shows you rather than just telling you. It teaches you how cruel the world can be, but also how you can get by. You want to learn because learning is necessary to survive, and never has Zelda offered us such a compelling world to explore and survive in. Back to difficulty though, one thing that makes this game the most challenging 3D Zelda yet is naturally the combat. Like I said, combat up until now has been fairly straightforward, and as long as you were patient, you wouldn't take much or any damage. Skyward Sword was definitely different. It required properly executed motion-controlled strikes in specific directions, and just swinging your sword around wildly wouldn't get you anywhere. I can sort of applaud this aspect of it, but I think the overall execution was lacking. I want my fighting to actually take effort, though not the kind of effort that makes my arms tired and makes the game significantly less comfortable to play. Also, no matter what game you're talking about, motion controls will never be 100% reliable, and the game doing one thing while you're trying to tell it to do another is never fun or fair. But as it does with many, many things that previous Zeldas attempted, Breath of the Wild takes the idea of more challenging and engaging combat and really nails it. And it's hard to pin down exactly what is so much better about it. It just feels so much less mechanical and exploitable than it used to. There's a very natural feel to it. Instead of finding ways to open baddies up to attack as though they're puzzles, it's about just killing them. Finding a way to do enough damage that they die from it. When you counter an enemy, it's not because the A button went ba-da-dip and told you it was time to counter. When you counter an enemy, it's because you avoided their attack and followed up with your own, like a counter works. There's so many ways to go about fighting and so many moves you can do, especially when you consider the runes and all the environmental stuff. If you take out your bow while you're in the air, you can slow down time and take better aim. This alone opens up an enormous amount of options, and most importantly is just really cool. It's just really fun and empowering to pull off. It makes you feel really awesome doing all these rad matrix shots all over the place. Successful parries are your reward for learning your enemy well and honing your reaction time. Then there are flurry rushes to try and pull off, and these can be pretty tricky too. There are times when you'll set one off without much effort, but other times it just won't seem to work right. There's just a lot to combat this time around. It's so much more complex than it's ever been. In fact, I've put over 200 hours into the game, and I still don't feel like I've mastered the combat. I still find myself struggling sometimes when I'm fighting a big baddie without using any tricks like runes or bomb arrows, getting walloped while I try and fail again and again to dodge an attack and get my rush. One of the biggest changes, though, is that unless you're strong enough to take them out in a couple hits, even the smallest guys won't let you just sit there and wail on them like past baddies. They'll block your attacks, which will damage your weapon, and unless you're able to knock their shield out of the way, they'll inevitably hit you back. And if they're wailing on you, naturally you can't just sit there and block everything either. Your shield is just as likely to break as your sword. It's just so much harder this time around to completely incapacitate monsters. So if there happen to be a lot of them around, fighting becomes something you've really got to think about. The name of the game is strategy. You can't always just launch yourself into any situation or you're likely to get your clock cleaned. You've got to practice fighting, know your enemy, make sure you've got enough firepower to last you through the battle, and in many cases, try your best to deal as much damage as you can before your foes have even spotted you. And speaking of breakable weapons and shields, this is something that I was initially a little worried about, but I soon saw how much it improved the game. Once more, this will all sound familiar to you if you've watched my video in defense of Breath of the Wild's brittle weapons, but seeing as this is a comprehensive review, I'd like to go over it again. And I know that this is a very hot button topic. There are people very firmly on both sides of the fence. But here's the way I see it, at least. Breakable weapons and shields limit the player. Like I said, they're one thing that makes the game so challenging, especially at first. The ability to attack in Breath of the Wild is no longer something you can take for granted. It's a resource. It's something that can be depleted and needs to be actively maintained. And early on in the game, this basically forced me to learn how to fight and learn all the different ways that I could kill baddies. I had to learn how to sneak and execute stealth kills, or utilize rolling boulders and exploding barrels. I had to use whatever weapons I found, which led me to learn how to use the different weapon types, which I then discovered were useful in different situations. I learned the importance of a well-aimed arrow, and when to use a spear versus a sword, and how to effectively throw nearly broken weapons for critical damage. Critics of this breakage system usually cite two primary issues that they have with it, and I'll address them here. First, they don't like that the game forces them to do anything. They feel that in an open-world game that offers a great sense of freedom as a selling point, no single mechanic should be thrust upon them, and if they want to use a single one-hander the whole game, they should be able to do just that. And I kind of see where they're coming from here, but I just can't agree. Being limited and disadvantaged is one of the things that makes Breath of the Wild so refreshing and unique. Do you really want to just play the same old Zelda where you go around trouncing every single guy you come across? Because that's what it would be like if you had even one decent unbreakable sword at the very beginning. It would completely destroy the very delicate balance of difficulty that the Zelda team crafted here. Encouraging you to adapt and try new things is a very deliberate design choice that helps distinguish the game from past entries, and all that would go out the window if your weapons didn't break. Plus, it only forces you to explore other avenues of fighting at the very beginning. Once you really get rolling, the game throws enough weapons at you that you've got a lot of freedom and can kill baddies however you want. At the absolute worst, you'll be annoyed that you've got to use a spear because you ran out of one-handers, but you certainly don't have to keep sneaking and shooting and magnesising if you don't want to. Secondly, they don't like how the weapons break so darn quickly because the threat of losing a good weapon makes them not want to ever use it. And in the beginning, I will admit that the weapons do break absurdly fast. This is the game teaching you how to play and offering you an incentive to keep adventuring for better and better stuff. But again, as you move through the game, they start lasting longer and longer, and you gain access to more and more of them. It is not long at all before you've got more weapons than you know what to do with. So people who don't want to use their weapons, I don't normally like the get over it attitude when it comes to gaming. I truly believe that most, if not all, opinions are valid opinions. If you feel something about a certain aspect of a game, then that's just how you feel. We all have wildly differing tastes. But in this particular case, you gotta get over it, man. This is completely a hang-up that I understand, and in fact, I even feel it myself in this game sometimes, but it's one that you just have to get around. You just have to ignore, because it doesn't make any sense. Using your low-level weapons because you don't want to waste your best ones will slow down your progress toward getting more great weapons. Like, you will overall have more higher-level stuff if you just use your stuff and get through those baddies faster. Later in the game, Hyrule throws more awesome swords at you than you know what to do with. This little hang-up is too silly a thing to spoil the whole experience because it's not even a thing. It's not even a real problem. It's an imaginary one. When in doubt, just use it. You will always get another one later. Suffice it to say, I love the breakage system. I love how it led me to really learn how to play the game, and on a more kinda dumb video gamey level, I love the constant satisfaction of finding cool stuff. I'm constantly like, oh cool, another Lionel sword. Ooh, look at the bonus on this Guardian Spear ++. Oh yeah, some shiny new shields. As long as I keep moving forward and smashing everything I pick up over the heads of my foes in that intensely satisfying way, I'll always be stupidly pleased to find even more stuff to smash over the heads of my foes. It's a very effective feedback loop. Swinging back around to difficulty one final time, because sometimes I'm terrible at structuring my reviews, I want to talk about one more element of Breath of the Wild that really blew me away, that really hit home that this was a very different Zelda game. See, I never stumbled upon the Stone Talus on the Great Plateau, but the Zelda team did very cleverly place one right along the path to Kakariko Village, just in case. I ran into this one, and this was obviously my greatest challenge yet. The thing was just massive, and since I had so few hearts and such lame armor, it could squish me in one hit. Yeah, a Zelda game with an enemy that could one-shot me. This was really happening. I fought the thing for ages, reloading my save again and again, learning its moves and stunning it and using up all my weapons trying to bring it down. And I'm sure plenty of other people have figured out ways to beat these things with nothing more than a mop and a Korok leaf or something, but not me. I reached a point where I just looked at it and went, I'm not strong enough to beat this thing. I'm playing a Zelda game and fighting a boss, and I'm just not good enough at fighting, nor do I have enough equipment to bring this thing down. I don't have enough hearts, and my swords aren't strong enough to do the job. So I just left. I ran away to Kakariko, and this was huge. This was just so different. It was exhilarating and exciting because moving forward, that Stone Talus was always in the back of my mind, and I dreamed of the day I would be strong enough to bring it down. And sure enough, I did. I came back later, and it was a great challenge, but after a long struggle, I did it, and it felt awesome. That sense of victory was not only new for Zelda, but also for Nintendo. I'd never felt so accomplished playing any Nintendo title. I'd never felt like I rose to a challenge like that before. This wasn't just getting the hookshot, then going into the boss room and using the hookshot on its big hookshotty butt or whatever. This was a creature that was just plain hard to fight. It was just strong. And they put it in front of me right at the start of the game so that I knew I had something to work toward. It was up to me to get better at fighting and get stronger gear, and whenever I was ready, I could try again. And when I finally beat the thing, that was me beating it, not my hookshot, or my bombs, or my boomerang, not its big hookshotty butt, or its glowy eye, or whatever. Yeah, I had tools at my disposal. Yeah, it had a weak spot, but the victory wasn't handed to me. I earned it through my hard work. I think it also has something to do with the fact that this guy was optional. It's one thing to reach a hard enemy in a game and have to try a bunch of times before you can beat it and move forward, but Breath of the Wild's open world with all of its enemies that you can walk up to at any time, it's somehow much more thrilling. Each challenge feels more personal. Each one is your challenge. It's always there, waiting for you to give it another shot. And overcoming a challenge like that is so much more rewarding than overcoming one that you had to overcome in order to beat the game or whatever. It makes a game feel less like just a game and more like your own private adventure. And that Stone Talus may have been the first big foe to trounce me many times before I could in turn trounce it, but it wasn't the most notable. Climbing up to Shatterback Point to collect 20 shock arrows was an unreal experience. It was the run-in with the Stone Talus times 10. As I talked about in the section on exploration, the sight of the Lynel terrified me, and of course it wasn't long at all before I discovered that it could kill me dead with one arrow. I fought that thing for probably an hour before I decided I just couldn't do it. I wasn't even coming close to beating the thing. I was barely leaving a scratch on it. So I gave up. Problem was, I still needed those shock arrows. So I was forced to sneak around and collect them, and as I did so, I was scared out of my mind. This was not me sneaking because this was a stealth section and the game demanded that I sneak or else I would get thrown in jail or have to start over or something. This was me sneaking because if the bad guy saw me, it would murder me. And not in a little insta-fail, try again kind of way. No, it would just chase me and hit me until I was dead. And this was terrifically exciting. I know I've been saying it a lot, but again, it didn't feel like something from a Zelda game. It was so different and so much more. Eventually, I gathered up enough arrows, but I vowed to return someday and defeat that beast. That Lynel was my white whale, my new objective, even above freeing the Divine Beasts and beating Ganon and saving Hyrule. I absolutely had to kill that thing. So I came back every once in a while, and still it managed to overpower me many, many times. But each time I brought its health down a little lower. I lasted a little longer. And one day, finally, after many long hours in the game and many, many attempts, I did it. I climbed that mountain, and the fight that ensued was legendary. I probably learned more about combat from that one fight than I did from the entire rest of the game. I learned its moves and how to counter each one. I perfected the timing of my shield parry and wailed on it with a two-hander whenever it was stunned. I felt like an animal. I had fire in my eyes. Not even the hardest Zelda bosses had ever tested my mettle like that or demanded such timing and precision, but everything the game asked, I delivered. I drained that thing's health, and when it finally fell with a roar, I too roared. I raised my fists to the sky in triumph and made my victory known to all who could hear my mighty cry. It was, and still is, the strongest sense of accomplishment I've felt in any Zelda. It was absolutely glorious. Later, I would find different colored Lionels that would strike me with terror and dread all over again. Wait, there's a white one too? But as time went on, I got even stronger and learned how to fight them even better, and now I can make short work of the toughest Lionels out there. Sometimes after a blood moon, when they all respawn, I'll go Lionel hunting, just to do it, just to show them who owns Hyrule. And this aspect of the game's difficulty leads us to the next topic, progression. Breath of the Wild does not work like any other Zelda when it comes to progression, because every other Zelda up to this point has largely based its progression on items. Items grant you new abilities, which allow you to reach new areas and beat bosses. That's really Zelda in a nutshell. But Breath of the Wild gives you all of your runes, which are essentially your items, right at the beginning. Once you leave the Great Plateau, you've technically got everything you need to go and complete all the game's major objectives. The entire map is open to you from the start. There is still some sense of progression though. There are a handful of different obstacles that will try to keep you from certain areas, but I'd say the two things the game uses most to gate you off are your combat strength and your stamina meter, i.e. hard monsters and things like tall cliffs or large bodies of water. Since we've been going over difficulty, let's cover the former first. The world is filled with baddies, with difficulty levels denoted by a series of colors. Finding and completing shrines will cause all the baddies in the world to slowly scale up, and from what I can tell, they'll usually scale relative to each other. If you find a place with 2 moblins and a blue moblin, later they might become 2 blue moblins and a black moblin, then later 2 black moblins and a silver moblin. Most Lionels will eventually become silver, though some of the ones that were meant to be easier will stay at lower levels. The outliers here are the Guardians, because they don't seem to scale at all. They're extremely deadly for a lot, if not most of the game, but eventually you get strong enough to take them out with relative ease. This whole scaling system provides a pretty good balance. If every enemy was a static difficulty, then progression would be much more limited. You would basically be forced to only tackle the lower level areas until you'd gotten strong enough to hit the harder areas. Heading anywhere new, it would just come down to luck if you were strong enough to move forward, and of course you would eventually reach some new area and realize that you were supposed to hit it earlier, and look at that, now every single enemy is so laughably weak that it's no fun. But here, the option to go somewhere is pretty much always on the table, and just often enough you'll be blocked by tougher foes to keep things interesting and provide some of that very nice challenge I was talking about. The game provides freedom and challenge in good measures. As I said, Guardians are the only enemies that don't scale. Each one, regardless of its type, lives where it lives and never gets stronger. And I think this is a really important element of the game. If scalable enemies help keep things balanced, these unscalable ones balance it further by selectively turning just some areas of the game into particularly difficult challenges to overcome. There aren't so many Guardians around that you never feel like you can go where you want to, but there are just enough to instill a very thrilling sense of danger and build what are essentially progression gates. But of course, gates that you can hop if you're good enough. Early on, when Guardians could vaporize me with one blast and seemed to have way more HP than I could ever possibly hope to dish out, I was all the more intrigued by the places they guarded. All of Hyrule Castle seemed so mysterious and terrifying, and I never wanted to get close because there were always so many stalkers around it. If a place was patrolled by Skywatchers, I had to hold my breath and sneak around and pray they didn't see me and blow me to smithereens. And whenever I did manage to get past them, it felt like I was going somewhere I wasn't supposed to. If a place is guarded by enemies that are way too strong for me to fight, I must be breaking the system by sneaking in. Oh man, if Ganon catches me here, he's gonna be so mad. The whole idea of every area being open to me for the most part, but some being so much more dangerous than others was really fantastic. Talk about a sense of place. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule feels so much more real because it doesn't feel like the whole thing is fed to you in bits with little choice on your part. You're not totally blocked off from any major areas, but some of them do take a lot of extra work to get to. And of course, as you can guess, it feels awful good when you do get strong enough to just waltz in these tougher areas and cut stalkers to pieces left and right. Whether you're hitting these places early or late, it feels great. It feels like you really earned it. Enemies may scale as you complete shrines, but of course you get stronger as well. The goddess orbs you find in shrines can be exchanged for hearts or extra stamina. Both hearts and stamina feed into your combat ability naturally, either increasing the number of hits you can take or how big of a spin attack you can do and how much you can sprint. Let's talk about stamina next though, because that's the other thing that largely determines where you can and can't go in Breath of the Wild. You can climb just about any surface, which opens up immense exploration possibilities, but if you run out of stamina at any point, you fall. Similarly, it takes stamina to glide with your paraglider or swim across water. This is extremely clever because it means despite the fact that you've technically got all the tools you need to beat the game, your ability to explore is increased directly by exploring. The ability to reach new areas more effectively, or even at all in some cases, comes from reaching new areas, finding and completing as many shrines as you can. It's a very rewarding system and it feels very natural. It gives the world a certain amount of consistency and logic. Sure, you can go anywhere you want, but are you strong enough to climb that cliff? Can you hold on long enough to glide out to that island? And this of course goes hand in hand with the Korok Seed weapon slot system that I talked about in the section on exploration. That's another way in which you're rewarded with more strength the more you explore. The more Koroks you find, the more weapons you can hold, the more damage you can do, the more places you can go. Overall, these elements make running around and doing stuff worth doing. A game this big and open, Nintendo could have easily messed up in this department, creating a huge world to explore but offering little reason to do so, or making it so open that it was easy and boring. They pulled it off though. Even without being based on items, Breath of the Wild's progression system is fun and satisfying. It does have a few problems though. The biggest one is that while they did a pretty good job of replacing item-based progression, I don't know if they can ever truly do it. Like, while I obviously enjoy the way Breath of the Wild does progression, there's always that little part of me that misses the old way. I mean, it was at the core of Zelda's identity, just as it is with Metroid, for example, and I can definitely see where people are coming from when they dislike Breath of the Wild for straying too far from the Zelda formula to feel like a Zelda game anymore. I was a little bummed when I first found out that the Great Plateau contained all the quote-unquote items. In the end, the immense freedom and other forms of progression were enough for me to be okay with this new system, but who's to say that moving forward in the series I won't start to miss the old way even more than I do now? Maybe a mix of the two systems would be the best of both worlds? I know it's a delicate process, but I'm pretty sure they could fit at least a little more in there to block the player's path in the future. Just a little. Backtracking for the sake of backtracking isn't exactly fun, especially in a game this big, but at the same time, it's hard to replace the satisfaction of carving your way into new areas because of a new item or ability you found, of having the world open up as you play. But I don't know, I could probably do a whole video just on this topic, so let's move on before we get in over our heads. Another problem I have is how weapons scale. When you beat shrines and get orbs, you get hearts and stamina, and that's great because it's tangible. It means something. You accomplish more, you get stronger. But on top of that, beating shrines makes the loot you find scale up, whether it's being held by foes or hidden in chests. This is actually the primary way that you get stronger, as in the way you raise your attack. You don't gain actual levels, your base attack doesn't go up, you just find better weapons as you go. Your armor rating goes up and you gain other bonuses by acquiring and upgrading armor, but let's save that for another section. This weapon scaling system is obviously to help you keep up with these scaling enemies. Like I said, I like the scaling enemies because they keep the game interesting, otherwise too many areas would be worthlessly easy and boring, but when combined with this weapon scaling, the whole thing starts to feel a little arbitrary. Technically, it is all happening because you're beating shrines, so it's a little like you're leveling up or whatever, but I often stop and think, I wish I was getting stronger. I wish my strength was more about building up my character and less about what weapons the game decides to spawn for me. It's like if it's gonna scale both the enemies and the weapons kinda equally, it might as well give me a rainbow Lionel with 1 billion health and a sword with 10 million attack. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of a false sense of progression in a way. It's not like the whole thing is worthless or anything. It does feel nice to move forward and get stronger, and eventually you get to the point where you dominate everything, which means the baddies and the weapons aren't moving at exactly the same speeds, but I just think they could have come up with a better way for the game to pull you along than just slowly spawning better and better weapons. Even a traditional leveling system with a growing attack stat would have worked really well, especially because that would mean getting XP from enemies, and that would be a dream come true for me. Or hey, maybe you don't need XP. Maybe the spirit orbs could be exchanged for hearts or stamina or attack power. That would make things even more interesting. This system is especially lame when you consider how loot that you find in treasure chests within shrines doesn't scale for whatever reason. And if it doesn't scale, well, of course they don't want to risk you finding weapons way above your level, so for most of the game you're opening chests and just throwing away what you find inside. The special weapons you get from each of the divine beasts, same thing. they're just worthless. Chances are they're not going to be as strong as the other stuff you're getting, at least if you're taking your time with the game, so it kind of feels like, what's the point of even having them? I never used any of the legendary weapons, not even once. My last problem with the progression system is that it's kind of ruined by one of the abilities you get in the game. 2 words, Revali's Gale. This allows you to fly way up in the air on a big gust of wind, and yeah, you've got a limited amount of gales before you have to recharge, but the weight is really not a big deal. The only reason this move didn't ruin too much of my fun was that I did a substantial amount of the game before heading to see the reto. Some of the most fun I had in my initial run was trying to scale tall cliffs or figuring out how to traverse extra tricky areas. Akala Tower? Oh man, why couldn't more of the game have been like this? Surrounded by Ganon gunk and rubble? How are you supposed to get up there? A total head scratcher. Then there's Hyrule Castle. I had a ton of fun sneaking in early and trying to figure out how to get to the top. It's that puzzle thing Eiji Aonuma was talking about before the game came out, how in Breath of the Wild you'd be able to go anywhere, but figuring out how to get to some places would be the puzzle. Oh, that's how. Puzzle over. Puzzle solved. Once you get Revali's Gale, so much of the challenge of traversal is gone in an instant. It's just overpowered. It throws off the wonderful balance of stamina and how it affects your progression entirely. It's the kind of thing that I'm glad exists, because after a while, I do want to just get everywhere I want easily. It's fun to eventually overcome your limitations and work your way up to being godlike in any game, but it's just too easy to get here. Now that I know the move exists, when I start a new playthrough, I'm either going to hit that Divine Beast first and get it first thing, or I'm going to be exploring and constantly wishing I had it, because it's much harder to live without when it's within your grasp and you know how easy it makes everything. The other champion powers are pretty OP too, to be honest, and also managed to negate a lot of great design choices. Seriously? Mipha's Grace? Basically a fairy that recharges and maxes out my health so I don't really have to be careful anymore? Revali's Gale is the one that comes closest to undermining what the game is trying to achieve, though. One thing that would have solved all OP problems with the champion powers would be to make each power pretty weak from the start and require leveling up. Maybe sometimes when you clear a shrine, in addition to an orb, you get something that makes one of your powers stronger. More height for Revali's Gale, more hearts for Mipha's Grace, more charges for Daruk's Protection, more power and range for Urbosa's Fury, and how about lower recharge times across the board? I feel this would have helped balance the game, and on top of that, it would have given us even more to work for and feel good about achieving. We would still feel awesome gaining these abilities. Holy cow, I can just shock guys now? Awesome! But they wouldn't throw things out of whack like they do now. All in all, it ain't perfect, nor is it very Zelda-y, but the progression system in Breath of the Wild still works pretty darn well. I would definitely like to see some tweaks and additions in the hypothetical sequel, but I still had a lot of fun with it. Between the stamina system, the scaling, the new levels of challenge, and the weapon breakage, it makes for an incredibly fresh experience. I can easily say that Breath of the Wild is much more engaging and takes much more thought than Zelda's of old. And even if some of that classic Zelda feel was lost along the way, I'm very thankful for what it accomplishes.